the New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT. Greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm Paul Spain, and with us today we have Will Hewitt from HeartLab. How are you, Will?
Good, thanks, Paul. And yourself?
Very good, very good. Nice to get a chance to chat today. Welcome. It's your first time on the show, so maybe you can start with a little intro of where you fit into this big wide world of tech and startups in New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on the show, Paul. I think we've met a couple of times now. So my name's Will. I'm the CEO and founder of HeartLab. I've been around the New Zealand technology ecosystem for a few years now, since I was fresh out of high school. Been involved with a few different startups. Around 4 years ago, founded HeartLab, which is my the primary venture I've been involved with. We're a medical device company. We build software for cardiologists and cardiac hospitals, and we sell our software here in New Zealand and overseas.
Yeah, really looking forward to delving into that today. There's obviously kind of a lot going on in the world at the moment, and it's been a strange old time with COVID. But with what's happening in Ukraine, I thought really there's always this crossover. The threads of technology really run through everything that tends to happen in our lives and in the world of business. It's quite hard to separate tech from everyday life. It's so integral now. And it just got me to thinking a little bit about, the situation in Ukraine, and look, what's the role of technology, and what are the things that we should be, taking note of? What are maybe some of the unintended consequences that, can happen? There was, just over the last couple of days or so, like maybe 3 or 4 days, we've started hearing more about sort of digital sanctions. So Netflix saying, okay, no, sorry, Russia, not that they've got a big base of customers there. I think they've got about 1 million customers in Russia, of population of over 200 million. But they've stopped there. I note they've put up a documentary on about Ukraine. I think the 2004 situation. There's that's been moved from Netflix actually, and put up on YouTube, so it's available for free. It's quite interesting. Yeah. Microsoft have put out a statement, and this one really caught my attention, because I'm just sort of imagining for a business wherever they are in the world that relies on a Microsoft or a Google or an AWS. How does that play out if the technology company that you rely on says they're going to pull the rug out from under you? So I was kind of curious, what does that actually mean from Microsoft? And Brad Smith from Microsoft has shared in a blog post online about it, and basically they've started out by talking about and condemning the invasion of Ukraine, and then they sort of move into talking about their protection from a cybersecurity perspective that they've been involved in Ukraine. But they also talk about that they aren't going to be, they're effectively suspending new sales of Microsoft products and services in Russia. I mean, we don't know the full detail on that, but you can imagine that could have quite a catastrophic impact.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me the sort of companies are taking there's two types of stances on it here, right? There's there's companies that are taking the moral stance of, we don't want to offer our services in Russia, either because we obviously disagree with what they're doing, or because in some way, shape, or form we might be used to support their war efforts, right? And then there's the ones who are taking the slightly more benign approach of, well, they can't pay us anymore because of the various financial sanctions, and we aren't allowed to sell because of those financial sanctions. So there's the slightly more, slightly more democratic one, I guess, and not quite as principled as some of them. But we're a company that also uses Microsoft products, right? And especially in countries like Russia, I imagine they have more businesses that rely on some of those older products like Word, Excel, etc. Having those services, Paul, it's actually quite meaningful, right? That's how a lot of them are running a lot of their businesses.
Yeah, so when they talk about new sales, what the blog post doesn't go into is, well, what is a new sale? Is adding some users to something you're doing already, or is spending a little bit more on your, existing cloud environments? Is that a new sale?
Yeah.
I'm guessing probably not. So I don't, the way I read it anyway, is that they're not sort of completely, pulling the rug out. But I think this is going to be quite, interesting to follow. And of course, there will be, although there will be some impact on positive organizations in Russia, and let's realize that this is an invasion that's very much controlled by Putin, and it's not something that the entire populace is on board with, right? Now we have heard over the last few months about human rights groups basically being shut down in Russia, and media. So there's not too much of those sorts of organizations left that might be there to serve a really good cause. But I imagine that there are going to be orphanages and all sorts of other entities that rely on technology and all sorts of things from the outside world. So there must be some unintended consequences that come in here.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. I guess it's the it's the takeover. Are we trying to punish the population to essentially get them to disagree with their leadership, or are we trying to target sanctions against people which are the Russian political leadership, which actually are the ones actually the ones who are perpetrating the crimes here? And so it's an interesting distinction, right? Because on the one hand, you want it to sort of be quite meaningful to the whole population, but on the other hand, there's some very legitimate use cases and very legitimate needy causes over there still, I'm sure. But look, I think by and large, it's a good reason that people are, by and large, technology companies are joining in with, countries around the world and condemning it and restricting what they sell. They're essentially sending a message that they don't support what's going on.
Yeah. And then sort of looking at other areas of technology, the media, has always leveraged technology. And, during World War II, there were, broadcasts going in and local languages into, Germany and so on. And we've got, stories around Enigma machines and all sorts of things. But it does seem as though, the Russian regime are trying to block as much as they can from outside with sort of packages on social media channels and so on. And although they might not have the same approach as China's had with the Great Firewall of China, I don't think there's probably too many internet service providers and companies that are going to be saying no to Putin. Anyone that just wants to stand in the street and protest, or somebody that wants to share a view that's opposing to the government and say, hey, this is a war, that could be 15 years in jail. So there's a fair bit of might from the regime on that front, but it does seem the things we're hearing is, BBC's varying efforts and others are certainly getting picked up in Russia. So
right, I remember seeing a report that a BBC reporter had, the hotel made them pay the check early because they were worried it wasn't going to clear. It's look. it's the reality that, when you do such a, they're doing an obviously relatively terrible thing. That's the global outcry from both technology companies and countries, and it's just a harsh reality that they're going to face, rightfully so.
Yeah, and there's the whole payment side with Amex and Visa and MasterCard, PayPal. I think all of those are have said, look, no, we're not going to facilitate payments anymore in the usual manner, which brings us to crypto. Interestingly enough, to cryptocurrencies, and I guess that one of the things with these sort of decentralized technologies is that it gets very hard to control, and there are positive aspects to that, but potentially there's a bit of flip side here at the moment where a lot of folks feel like, well, we don't want this to be the mechanism through which Russia is able to handle payments.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, right? Because by blocking out Russia and its partners from those various payment networks, it's driving them to alternatives like Union Pay and SIPs, etc., which we've talked about earlier. And it's it's an interesting time that's sort of threatening Visa and MasterCard sort of I can't remember. There's some famous investors talked about Visa and MasterCard's duopolies finally under threat this year from those combination of factors. Right? You've got cryptocurrency now, which is actually starting to if it starts getting a little bit more stable, and I appreciate there probably are some coins that are starting to get closer to that as opposed to maybe Bitcoin or Ethereum. They become quite viable payment methods that people can reliably put their money into. But I think that the problem we're probably still at now is it's not mainstream accepted.
That's true. That could be one of the unintended consequences that that maybe could happen. Is you might see a bigger adoption of those of the cryptocurrencies, for better or for worse, depending on what perspectives that you look at it from. And there will be those scenarios under which various technologies might grind to a halt because of the situation, or might accelerate at a pace. And we'll come to talk about EVs in a little while. But that was one of the areas we were discussing before we started the show today. Now you mentioned Union Pay. They're a Russian sort of a equivalent credit card provider, aren't they?
Chinese.
Chinese. And SIPS is their payment system that's got some similarities to the SWIFT system for international transactions.
They're without forgetting, they're on a far lower scale, right? I think respectively they both do in basis points of volume compared to the likes of Visa or MasterCard. They're a long way off getting deplatformed from their current positions. And if they're going to get deplatformed, I don't think it's going to be from the likes of Union Pay. I think it's going to be from the likes of either, I think there's a lot of leaks in some of the central bank controlled cryptocurrencies that are sort of being perpetuated, because that addresses, I think, a lot of the existing gripes with the payment systems that are out there now. Look, it's not controlled by central powers like, Swift, for the record, have done a particularly relatively good job. I don't think Swift's someone people should be hating on. Maybe Visa or MasterCard have been killing off retailers by 1,000 cuts with fees. But, Swift does a good job for us. But there's some technical advantages, but also it's still banked by a reserve with I'm pretty sure they've got little hunks of gold in the ground, right? That say, this right here, there's a government that's been around 200 years, probably be around another 200, that's willing to back that your dollar is going to be worth plus minus 5% a dollar in a year's time.
Yeah. I'm not too sure on how much of this stuff is backed by gold these days, but certainly there's an assuredness when it's backed by somebody. And I guess that's the flip side of it, pulled into few sort of discussions. I spent half an hour with one of the mainstream media outlets yesterday on a long-winded interview on the metaverse, of which they'll probably snip out 3 or 4 minutes or something. There's so many aspects to these things, but there is that assuredness, and there's still a level of anonymity that sort of sat around some things in the the crypto and NFT worlds, and you certainly see some downsides to that, but of course, we step back with what's going on at the moment, depending on, where you are in the world and what you believe in, politically and so on. I think, most would feel that there are some untrustworthy elements at a government level as well. So, there probably is no perfection on a lot of these things, is there?
There's certainly large sections of society that don't trust it. Don't trust a dollar, whether it's a digital or not, that comes from the government.
Yeah. I mean, on the communications front, the other one that sits in that space, Telegram, seems to have become a helpful tool, and not just not just say in Ukraine or further field. I think in Russia as well, we're reading that it's it's become a tool to fight the propaganda, because of it being encrypted in nature, and has generally been able to get through to people. So it's I don't know, that one's I kind of find quite fascinating when we look at the role of encrypted communications in World War II, and now encrypted communications, have gone very mainstream in recent years.
I guess services like Telegram, at least they've found themselves a relatively in times of war like now in Russia and Ukraine, they've found themselves a specific place there where there's a very good reason that you don't want people to be able to look at your messages. But a particularly good reason. And I think some of the more mainstream providers like Facebook and stuff, I think they've started adding, further and further encryption methods to make sure your communications are more private. But look, whenever we access any online service, all of us are essentially trading privacy for convenience, right? And everyone just has a different threshold with which they're happy to trade privacy for convenience. And some people, and I'd probably be willing to argue that, at least 50% of the populace probably are willing to trade a fair bit of privacy in exchange for convenience. But then there's certainly the chunk of the populace that would rather use services that are probably moderately less convenient, but ensure anonymity.
Yeah. Quite interesting. Sort of looking in a little bit, into the Telegram story, and the brothers that founded it, and I think they were both Russian born, and themselves having launched a social network in Russia, and then I think lost control of that, and there's all sorts of fascinating rabbit holes there, but it is it's definitely quite encouraging to sort of see the upsides of technologies like Telegram and how they can be used. So anything else that you thought? I was going to ask you actually, on the medical side, the sort of medical technologies, how's that stuff getting used? Have you come across any sort of coverage in your world that gives you insights to what's been happening there in Ukraine? I mean, I just think of scenarios like, well, I mean, there'd just be some really simple scenarios like people needing some help and video calling somebody remotely, through to I don't know even what exists or what's left operating in terms of hospitals and so on.
Yeah, it's because especially in those sorts of situations, your real focus is on that like critical end of care, right? Emergency medicine. I mean, I've seen companies like us, we don't really play in that critical end of the sphere. We're a little bit more, routine procedures. But I've seen interesting stories around, companies to do blood delivery by drone, for example, right? I know some of them are deploying resources over to Ukraine to support, getting care to in those sort of situations. I suppose logistics is your big problem, right? You have stuff over here that you need over here, but there's a big problem getting it from A to B, right? And the original deployment for that was in Africa, where just transport and logistics and cold storage logistics is, infrastructure just doesn't exist. And now it's because there's some pretty mean-looking people between you and where you need to get stuff to. I've seen things around that. Obviously, there's, some medical technology companies have stopped exports into Russia. That were one of the first sort of areas that got hit with sanctions, I think. But yeah, that's some of the more interesting ones I've seen.
Yeah, and you mentioned drones. Interesting that in Ukraine they've been using drones themselves to really help them defend themselves, which is the sort of flip side of usually when we're talking about drones, we're not really interested in how they can be used from a military purpose. I mean, obviously there are commercial reasons why those interests have existed, but usually even in terms of ethical investing and so on, these are the sorts of things that come up. Of if you're ethically investing, then you wouldn't be investing, in a company that does military drones. But now, during this time, suddenly these things are flipped, are getting a bit flipped because people are thinking, well, look, anything that can help, the Ukrainian population out right now, we want to get behind that. So,
It certainly changes the calculus. I've seen a few interesting conversations on this online. Does this change the calculus on what's ethical to invest in if it's actually supporting these people, from the onslaught they're facing? Does that change the calculus? And I know I'm personally not one who's I don't think I have the license to comment on whether or not that's the case. That's up for people who study ethics for a lot longer than me. But it does interestingly change up the calculus.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's going to depend what standpoint you come from, and to a degree, these things are quite personal opinions. But a company that's making military weaponry that's help or is helping Ukraine in all sorts of forms might be of interest to people. So. It's not a topic we're usually getting into here on the Tech podcast, but it's kind of that's the times that we're in. So onto the sort of unintended consequences of some of these things. We talked about maybe new payment systems, maybe some sort of change in habits and an increased uptake potentially of certain technologies, media outlets that are maybe going to gain a little bit more of a foothold if they can't if they can't be blocked by Putin's regime. But there are and there's probably lots of things that you can't necessarily figure out up front. But one of the things we talked about before the show kicked off was the price of petrol rising reasonably quickly. And although we've got an electric car and an electric moped for the family, we also have a petrol-based car. And so when news of the war broke, I jumped on the Z app. We tend to pre-buy petrol. They've got a facility on there called Share Tank, and you basically can buy your petrol, and it's based on where you are. I think it gives you a 30k radius, and you buy at the best price at a given time. So I bought a few tanks of petrol at the time. When I jumped back in, it was probably this morning to have a sort of a look at what had happened, and sure enough, the petrol price has gone up 10%, and I know our prices are a fair chunk more than Australia, and they're talking about it just keeping on going over there. So there was, I guess that's where the technology come in handy. Comes in handy in that case, but you raised the point that maybe this is something that's going to help with the adoption of electric vehicles.
It changes, at least in my view, it changes the economics of owning an EV, right? And it's still certainly at the moment, EVs are not cheap cars, right? Although Leafs and stuff are starting to get down to the point that actually maybe that is economic in its own right, but at least the higher end of the EV market, like Teslas, Polestar, some of those newer companies, it changes the economics when you have a $70,000 car that you don't have to spend $200 a week on gas on, right? Which is a meaningful chunk of what you could, put towards payments, whatever, on that car. And so a second order effect of this might actually be, the net positive for the planet of moving us away from oil-based energy, to using electric vehicles, hopefully not powered by a coal plant somewhere, but solar and wind generators. Similarly, the lack of LNG and other, lack of natural gas, etc., flowing out of Russia, which powers a good chunk of Europe. They'll similarly have to either find another source, which isn't straightforward, or move to technologies that they can procure themselves, like solar, wind, hydro. And those things take time to build, but and they'll certainly be looking towards fossil fuels for the interim fix. But I think it's changed their perception on what energy security means for them, right? And actually, being self-reliant from an energy point of view, ideally not on fossil fuels, but on renewables, is going to be a lot higher up the EU's agenda now, and similarly America's agenda, than it was, just 6 months ago.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you shared some numbers with me before the show for somebody's sort of personal example. Yeah. Do you want to share that?
Oh yeah. So my partner, she spends I think like $150 on gas a week, right? Payments on a Tesla is like $200. I'm like, well, that's only $50 more to get a nice new Tesla, and have to fill it up with gas all the time.
Yeah, and look, I had a somewhat similar discussion with a friend of mine last week, and he's got a family member in the Bay Area who's had a Tesla probably since before you could easily get hold of them in New Zealand. And he's always asked me, and so he was asking me again on Friday around should I buy a Model 3, and I said, well, look, the prices actually, especially with the government subsidies, and not just on the Model 3, but on, across the electric vehicles at certain price points where they come in for the subsidy, they're dramatically lower than what an equivalent electric vehicle was, 3 years ago. I think the Model 3 was around 77k, that sort of range when it came out here. So it's dramatically less, even though it has had a small upward movement in the last few weeks. But it seems quite likely with the varying supply chain challenges and so on, that we might well see the price of those move up in the not too distant future. So right now the economics are probably pretty good, especially if you do a lot of driving. You do drive long distances, right?
Yeah, it's if you're driving long distances, because when we're going to start seeing mainstream adoption, at least here in New Zealand, right, where we've got a really healthy used car market. There are plenty of cars in the country. We're not buying as many new cars as countries like the States. But when we get that sort of second or third generation of electric vehicles that are filtering down to where it makes economic sense for the average New Zealand family bringing home I think the average wage is like 50, 60 grand per annum, right? When it makes financial sense for that chunk of the population, that's when it's going to start being more common to see, Z petrol stations with EV chargers out front, more EV chargers out front than they have gas tanks.
Yeah. I think we've got some really, really interesting times ahead. Now, a little bit it has been quite a bit in the news actually to do with EVs, and of course Elon Musk always finds an excuse to be in the news, and he's always always tweeting. Today's tweet that I noticed was just there's another launch. I think it was a Star. It was definitely another SpaceX launch. Might have been a launch for Starlink. So there's a lot going on in that front. I guess that was one of the other areas actually tied in with Ukraine. Is that they've enabled Starlink service in Ukraine. But that's somewhat more complicated than what people might have realised, and they've recognised that by having a Starlink device on, the Russian government can potentially pinpoint people that have got them on and target you. So whereas that's probably not the sort of thing we'd normally be thinking about with other types of internet connections. Also, that probably there's visually that you could be seeing you've got one of these dishes set up. So kind of interesting there. But I thought it was encouraging to see the way that SpaceX have been playing their part, and they sort of seem to try and contribute where they can now in international scenarios, like we saw with Tonga, where they did some work to to offer some coverage there. I think it might have come a day or two late. The fibre had mostly been repaired at that point, but encouraging to see. We have heard that Tesla have been given the go ahead on their Berlin factory, which as they've got two and nearly, this will be their third, and then their Texas factory sort of opening shortly as well. This will be a significant increase. It'll take a while for them to scale up, but I think we will see them in a position of being able to sell a lot more vehicles in the year ahead once they. Or in the years ahead, once they scale up a little bit, but they've already said that they're going to sort of stick to what they've got rather than launching new vehicles at this time. It's quite interesting from a competitive perspective. When I look at it, that they're not going to compete with, say, Rivian and others by entering those other markets until they've got sufficient capacity, and they're saying, well, that's not going to be in 2022. So it does give those other players a bit of a chance to move ahead. But competition's good, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I guess that's really following classic good startup business methodology, which is don't get distracted by multiple markets, win in one market, then diversify, right? And Tesla's big enough now that they can win in a few markets, but still focusing on your core competencies. And they've had an interesting transition from having to go from manufacture to mass manufacture. Like Musk's talked about this at length, but building things once is hard, but building things once that you can build a lot of times is really, really hard, right? Like objectively harder than designing something just to build in the first place. And so, they've started to nail that. Car companies like Ford, they've had literally 100 or so years to get down pat with manufacturing techniques. And so I guess Tesla's now just going through its maturity stage, similar to how I'm sure like Rivian and other, Polestar, other EV companies are going to have to go through that. I think as businesses certainly go through different maturity steps in delivering their product. And, where you start in the way, even if your product looks quite similar, where you start and the way you deliver it is certainly nothing like what it's going to look like in 2-3 years' time, even though the innovation hasn't necessarily been in what you've produced, but how you're producing it.
It's fascinating to watch these journeys, and Rivian caught a little bit of flack in the last week when they announced some reasonably significant increases in prices, sort of 17 and 20% on a couple of their vehicles. The bit that probably would shock those who had pre-orders and that maybe some of them would be existing Tesla buyers, were a bit shocked to find out that those price increases were also being passed on to them, even though they thought they'd locked in at a particular price. Now, encouraging to see that Rivian hasn't held their ground on that. They've taken the feedback and said, look, we'll pass, those are still going to be the original price. So those folks that have got in early are going to be feeling pretty good about the deal they've got.
Yeah.
But that is, maybe something where there's a whole bunch of lessons there, both Rivian in terms of the impact on their credibility by taking this approach this early on in their business. How confident do people feel that they're going to be sort of looked after by them as a brand? But also the overall EV market. If Rivian are feeling like they need to do these increases, are we actually going to see this coming across with other brands? Are we up for a period where actually the prices are going up rather than that downward trend that we've had over the last few years?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, right? Because first on the Rivian piece, look, it's not irreversible brand damage, but it's certainly brand damage. When you're a business and you're a young business, brand is a very, you don't have a long track record for people to look back on, and they don't, it's not really a misstep that can be brushed away quite as quickly. But look, it's not an irreversible thing. People still really like their product. I'm sure people are still going to buy their product, but it's, it's a dumb misstep on their behalf, right? Brand is such an important part of what you do, especially as a car, which is probably the second most expensive thing people are going to buy in their lives. People, less so than some, than more mundane objects. People are going to look to and like the brand a bit more when it comes to buying a car. And then you're sort of talking second about, some of the price increases we're seeing. I guess I'd imagine that cars are probably, new car sales are probably going to be some of the first places that you see, the combination bullets of inflation, manufacturing costs increases, raw material increases, supply chain costs are increasing, the cost to get your materials from A to B is increasing. There are cost increases across the board. They probably don't have the margins to eat them up as much, and there's probably greater appetite and room to be able to bake that, to build in those increases into their pricing. It's not like the price of gas where people look at it, literally see it on the street every day when they drive down the road, right? You see that price change very immediately, but price increases and stuff like cars, they can probably get away with building some of that in sooner.
Yeah, interested talking about the brand damage because, some of the other brands, Ford and others in the US have been in a situation where, people maybe gone and put a deposit down on a vehicle with a local, car yard, whatever they're called these days. And then there been multiple scenarios in the US of then, purchasers being advised that, actually, we only got limited supply and the price is now, or those that are going to get a vehicle, are those willing to pop down maybe another $5,000 to actually get that vehicle, even though the price from the automaker hasn't gone up to the retailer. Those things have happened. So there's some interesting damage there, and to me, this is part of the the change we see in terms of how we buy vehicles. And I know we've seen Toyota in New Zealand sort of change their model with how they do vehicles. But you can see Tesla's approach of being able to control all of that. From end to end. They don't have another party that can come in and mess it up. They can mess it up themselves, as as they might have upset them, or they have upset people, I'm sure, on some occasions with the way that their prices can be, just changed from one day to the next. And in the same way that Rivian has, but the risk is kind of greater for the traditional automakers, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Tesla's done probably one of the most preferable things you can do as a business, which is control everything from the thing you built to the customers that use it, right? Apple is probably the king of demonstrating how having end-to-end control can mean you can deliver the most optimized experiences for customers, which in turn generates value, right? In terms of those dealers like trying to pull a fast one and make a few extra grand on the side, I am sure that the whatever VP deals with dealers directly in Ford was less than stoked about the brand damage they're doing on their behalf. And I think I saw some stories that I'm sure their allocations cut or something like that. As a business, that's the sort of thing you just want to clank down on, just for in reparation.
Yeah, nasty. Without coming into getting caught by authorities not getting caught. They've still got to operate within certain lines, right? And that's the Fords of this world can't actually control the retail price unless the retailer is part of them. That's also probably another thing in encouraging a change of models there. Last one on the vehicle sort of not even it is the vehicle sort of tech side of things. I drove the Polestar 2 recently. Really enjoyed it. It's the closest probably to Tesla in terms of the technology, because they've using Android Automotive in the vehicle, so in-car apps and so on, and I'm told getting reasonably regular updates. So some cool stuff there. But last week we saw photos of the Polestar O2, which is a pretty stylish looking sort of roadster type sports car, the point that jumped out in one of the headlines was it comes with an integrated drone for aerial filming. I think that's pretty cool. Every car should car should have that.
That's a unique selling point that not many cars are going to come with.
I don't know how they maintain and keep the drone technology kind of current, or if it becomes something like a traditional vehicle you buy and suddenly the Bluetooth stack's out of date and it won't work with your modern phone and the entertainment system's rubbish. But anyway, it sounds kind of fun. Now, kind of keen for us to delve in a little bit and hear what's been happening at HeartLab. Will some folks probably won't have heard of HeartLab at all, so maybe just a bit of an intro. It's a pretty exciting story.
Yeah. So HeartLab, so I started HeartLab around 4 years ago, sort of on some research I was doing, and hey, let's try to build some different AI systems, see if we can automate some parts of what cardiologists are doing their day-to-day job. Look, it was a project of passion at the time. It was interesting, could be fun. And then we built some technology which automates taking certain measurements on an echocardiogram, which is ultrasound of your heart, one of the most common cardiac scans, non-invasive, non-radiating, so safe, cheap, fast, common scan. Problem being, you'll have a cardiologist spending 20, 30 minutes after the scan going through and manually reviewing pages of measurements, manually taking measurements, writing up relatively mundane reports. So we built technology to automate parts of that, and then we started packaging it up to sell to cardiologists. But what we realized along the way is actually the thing that they don't like most about their workflow is they're using these really old legacy bits of software to have to write up these reports. Like they're having to go to a physical workstation or something like that. So we sort of said as a company, right, let's build the best bit of software for them to do their job every single day. Like, how can we get as much of the cardiologists say inside our software, and give them a really optimized experience that comes from consumer technology experience of building the user experience, building with the user in mind, rather than building with a problem in mind that you need to achieve with the software. Let's take into account the problem. Let's build it primarily with the user who has to use that software in mind. So we took the consumer technology approach to building an imaging platform for cardiologists, which we now, sell here in New Zealand and overseas. So we've been around 4 years now. We've raised several rounds of funding from various investors, both here in New Zealand and internationally. We've grown to a team of 20 odd. And at a pretty exciting point in our journey, we were about to head up to the States, about to start launching over there.
Fantastic.
Really exciting times for us.
Fantastic. Yeah, look, I mean, it's always exciting for for me to follow the different journeys of our New Zealand startups, and HeartLab's certainly one that's I think caught the attention of a lot of people, and so really excited to see where you go next. Now, I heard you your TEDx talk in Auckland. That would have been what was that, mid last year or something? It must early last year.
May, I think. May, April.
And one of the things that caught my attention was just around the way that artificial intelligence is being able to be used in the process of those electrocardiograms. But also it's not just handing it all over to the technology. The impression I got was that using technology actually allows the specialist to actually get more accurate results. Can you give us a little bit of sort of detail on how that works? Because it sounds like, hey, this is a perfect use case for technology.
It's AI in medicine is one of the more interesting use cases in my mind. It's certainly fascinated me, right? That's why I work in it now. And that you're very much never going to replace the human element of medicine, right? Medicine's quite aptly described as both an art and a science. Look, at the end of the day, treatment's anything that makes a patient feel better. And if that's a placebo pill, whatever. If that's going for a run, whatever. If that's putting them on the table, cutting them open, cutting something out of them, then that's what you have to do, right? That's a treatment in itself. So inherently AI, which is, glorified pattern recognition statistics, isn't going to be able to capture that full breadth of what it means to treat a patient. So, what we, as a company, and what, my personal vision for AI and the sorts of AI we're building for doctors is, let's build stuff that's going to augment clinicians, right? How can we do the parts of the clinician's day that they don't enjoy doing now? Let's take the mundane stuff and let's get them spending more time doing the art and the human part of medicine that they are either too strapped with time to do, or mostly primarily that really, they just don't have the time to do. So let's, that's sort of the principle of the technology we build is, let's build stuff that augments clinicians, automates the stuff that's boring, and then let them do the human parts of it. I think that sort of speaks to the volume of all successful AI medical technology companies. It's the ones that recognize that you're never going to get it is a very long time away, to the point where we're actually going to hand off entire clinical decisions to machines.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, right? Let's bring in the technology, and I've heard you probably heard it too, that AI stands for augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, because in general it's going to be that thing that adds on to to the humans in the process, and as a helper. So in that 4 years, one of the things that we often see with startups is you might start out with kind of one particular view in mind. This is what we're going to do. But then there's often quite a few changes and pivots. How's that, been for you? How much are you doing what you thought you'd be doing 4 years ago, and how much have you, sort of changed, adjusted, and pivoted so far?
Yeah, I mean, don't worry, our product certainly evolved. It's become a bigger product, is what I'd say, as we realize that the problem that we're going after is a bigger one than we initially thought we're setting out to achieve. So we haven't gone through any drastic pivots. And at least my personal take is, if as a company you're going through a dramatic pivot, at least once you've taken venture funding and once you're a little bit down the track and you've got some momentum, I can only think of a couple of situations where that's actually been successfully executed. There's a difference between a pivot, I suppose, and realizing something makes more sense and, working after that. We sort of have one of our internal values is, look, we're going to disagree and commit, right? Like we'll discuss the situation. We'll make the best decision we have with the information we have at a time. We'll all commit to that, even if everyone didn't necessarily agree that was the best course of action. Robust debate's absolutely encouraged and required to make good decisions. But the important thing is that you continue very diligently against the track that you've decided, because most importantly is doing what you think, doing what you set out to do, executing on a plan. As long as you can build a skill of executing on a plan and then are being able to actually be retrospective and say, was that the right plan to execute against? Do we need to change the plan? That's the mentality I think you have to have as a company.
Cool. And how are you going in terms of how ready is the product? If people are listening and this is their area, or that they know people that might be interested in your in your tech, who are the people that should be looking at it? And is it is it mature enough for many to be using yet, or is that still a few years off?
Oh, I mean, look, we've built a reliable, robust product now that is being used by clinics on real patients on a daily basis. We're certainly not an old product. It's certainly still an evolving product, but we've got our fundamentals down pat. So absolutely, if there's the sorts of people that lose our software, cardiology practices, imaging centers, hospitals, if there happens to be anyone like that listening, then absolutely, please reach out. We have a system we think you could be interested in looking at. But yeah, we're certainly down the track there.
Cool. And you're off to the US soon?
Yeah. It's going to be somewhat surreal traveling.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting. I guess you've waited up and decided now's the right time. Things are open. Yeah. You'll be able to get back into the country. How hard do you think the US market is at this stage? Have you spent much time focusing outside of New Zealand at this point, or has New Zealand been your primary?
No, the US has been New Zealand's great because we're close to customers. We really like the customers we work with here, and it's a good opportunity to test out your product before taking a large market in the States. But yeah, we spent quite a bit of time working on this already. This is really about trying to, meeting people that we've already had discussions with.
Great. Well, wish you all the best. We'll look forward maybe to another chat in the future after you get back to sort of drill in a bit more to the full HeartLab story in terms of where things are to date. But certainly, wish you all the best for that journey. And very, very exciting seeing you take innovative Kiwi technology out to the world. And so we hope for very, very good things.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's been a great chat.
Yeah, great to have you on the show. Thanks again, Will, and thanks everyone for listening in. We'll be back again next week. And just a reminder, most of our audience does listen in through, whatever their favourite podcast, audio podcast app is. But do look out for us across the social channels as well, as we are often streaming these live on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter. And also been doing some audio sessions on some of those platforms. Some will recall, we were doing things on the Clubhouse platform a lot last year. Now Facebook and LinkedIn are dabbling in audio rooms as well. So, a few tech discussions on those platforms as well. Good stuff. Thank you very much, Will.
Awesome. Good luck, Paul.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.